She can't hear the fire reaching the fuel line. Someone screamed from the crowd gathered on that Providence dockside road. She's deaf. She can't hear a thing. But Delaney Hale was already moving toward the smoke, and nobody in that frozen circle of bystanders could have stopped her if they'd tried. She felt the heat slam into her chest before her eyes found the flames a deep, rolling pressure that most people spend their whole lives running away from. Delaney ran toward it. At 28, she'd spent the last 16 hours on her feet, working the night shift in a community ER, the kind of place where the equipment is old, and the patients are poor, and a nurse learns to read a dying body the way other people read a clock. She'd been deaf since she was 4, since the meningitis that took her hearing and left her with something. The doctors never had a name for a way of feeling the world through her hands, her feet, the soles of her shoes against a trembling floor. She read lips. She read faces. She read the flicker of fear in a stranger's eyes a full second before his mouth caught up to it. What she'd never learned, not in 24 years of silence, was how to ask anyone for help, without feeling like she was handing them a reason to pity her, and that pride was about to collide with the most dangerous man in New England. Because the man trapped inside that overturned, burning Maybach wasn't an ordinary man. His tailored suit was soaked in blood, his driver wasn't moving, and the black SUV that had run him off the road was already disappearing down the waterfront. Delaney didn't know his name. She didn't know that he controlled every shipping container that moved through this harbor, that his enemies had just tried to erase him in broad daylight, or that pulling him out of that wreck would drag her straight into a war she couldn't hear coming. She only knew he was breathing, that his leg was pinned, and that the fire was winning. So she found a length of steel on the asphalt, wedged it under the crushed door, and used the only thing she'd ever truly trusted, her own 2 hands, in a stubborn refusal to walk away. She got him out with seconds to spare. The blast knocked her flat, and as the heat washed over them both, the man looked up at her through half-open eyes, his lips forming a single, broken question. Who? She told him her name. Then the world went gray. What Delaney Hale didn't know, couldn't have known, was that this stranger never forgot a debt, that a deaf nurse drowning in her brother's medical bills had just saved the life of a man who measured people the way other men measure money, and that the morning after, she'd wake to find 10 black SUVs lined up outside her rundown apartment building, engines idling, waiting. This is a story about a woman the world had written off as broken, who turned out to be the only person able to hear the one truth everyone else was too loud to notice. If a story about courage, dignity, and the quiet strength of someone the world underestimated moves you, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that dockside road, to the smoke and the silence, and find out exactly who Delaney Hale just pulled out of the fire. When Delaney came back to the world, the first thing she recognized wasn't sound, because for her there had never been sound, but the cold white light of the familiar fluorescent bulbs shining through her half-closed eyelids, and the faint trembling sensation of a wheeled bed being pushed across the smooth tile floor she had crossed thousands of times during long shifts. She knew this place. She knew it with the soles of her feet before she knew it with her eyes, knew it by the way the vibration of the wheels traveled up her spine, by the scent of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee that belonged to the community emergency room where she had worked for 4 years. Ironically, the nurse who was used to bandaging other people was now lying beneath bandages of her own, her forearm burned, 2 strips of white gauze wrapped from her wrist to near her elbow, and every time she moved, a dull ache spread outward like hot water soaking through cloth. Her head felt heavy in a way that she, as a nurse, immediately diagnosed for herself. A mild concussion, probably grade 1. Vision slightly blurred at the edges, but pupils still reactive. She tried to sit up, and a warm hand settled on her shoulder, holding her down gently but firmly. Delaney looked up and recognized that face at once. Mavis Thorne, the head nurse on the night shift, a 52-year-old woman with neatly cropped silver hair and eyes that had seen the worst things human beings could do to one another, was bending over beside her bed. What made Mavis different from most medical staff Delaney had met in her life was that Mavis never spoke to her in that loud, slow, pitying voice people often used with the deaf, as though volume could cure silence. Mavis simply turned so the light fell directly on her face, so Delaney could read her lips clearly. then spoke calmly and naturally. "You're awake. Good, you scared the whole department half to death." Delaney tried to smile, but her lips were dry and cracked. She lifted her hand to sign the question. "How long have I been here?" And Mavis, who over many years of working beside her had picked up enough sign language to understand simple sentences, raised 3 fingers and then pointed to the wall clock. 3 hours. She nodded, trying to piece together the last broken fragments of memory before everything had turned gray. But the harder she tried to remember, the more her head throbbed, so she let it go. Mavis placed a cup of water with a straw into her uninjured hand, and watched her drink with the tender severity of someone who had already decided she wouldn't stop keeping watch until she was satisfied. Around her, the whole emergency room moved in that silent rhythm Delaney knew so well she called it home, figures gliding past the glass door, a red alarm light flashing in a distant treatment bay and then going dark, a faint tremor passing through the floor when the ambulance door outside slammed shut. She felt all of it not as sound, but as a map of vibration and light that her body had learned to read since she was 4 years old. Then Mavis did something that made Delaney pay attention. She hesitated, reached into the pocket of her white coat, took out a piece of paper folded into quarters, and placed it in Delaney's unbandaged palm with a strange solemnity, as though she were handing over something far more important than its size suggested. "This came down from a surgeon a little while ago," Mavis said, her lips moving slowly. "He said you should read it when you woke up." Delaney unfolded the paper with still trembling fingers, and the doctor's messy but unmistakable handwriting appeared before her eyes. "The man you pulled out is in surgery. 2 more minutes and he wouldn't have had any chance left. You did everything right." Delaney read the words twice, then 3 times, and felt something both warm and sharp rise in her chest. Not quite pride, not quite relief, but the rare feeling of someone who had just realized that what she had done truly mattered to one specific life somewhere in this world. She folded the paper carefully and held it in her hand as though holding something fragile. Mavis watched her, and in the head nurse's eyes there was something that didn't entirely belong to the profession, a mixture of worry and admiration that she didn't put into words. "Do you know who he is?" Mavis asked, and Delaney shook her head. "No. I only saw smoke and then saw someone trapped." Mavis stayed silent a little longer than necessary, her lips parting as if she meant to say something more, and then deciding not to, and it was that moment of hesitation, that pause Delaney had learned to read more clearly than any spoken word, that made a vague question begin to kindle inside her. But she was too tired to chase after it. She rested her head back on the pillow, still clutching the paper tightly, and let her aching body sink into the first true rest it had known since everything had turned gray, not yet knowing that outside these 4 familiar silent walls, a world she had never stepped into had begun moving toward her. Lying in the familiar emergency room with the surgeon's note still clenched in her hand, Delaney let her mind drift back to the real reason that had pushed her out into the street at that fateful end of shift hour, back to the burden named Tad, her 19-year-old younger brother, whom she had raised like her own child since their parents died in a car accident 8 years earlier. Tad was everything she had left in the world, a tall young man with an honest smile and skillful hands who had dropped out of college to work as a laborer at a small shipyard near the harbor, because he said he didn't want his sister carrying one more debt on his behalf. Ironically, that very decision had become the beginning of everything, because 6 weeks earlier, a scaffold had collapsed at the yard, and a steel beam had fallen onto his back, leaving him with a spinal injury the doctors described in long medical terms. But all of it came down to one meaning, that if he didn't have reconstructive surgery within the next few months, Tad would permanently lose the ability to walk. The price of that surgery was $187,000, a number Delaney had read over and over on the estimate until it no longer frightened her and only left her tired down to the marrow. She had submitted a claim to the insurance company, with all the care of someone who worked in medicine, attaching every document, every scan result, every doctor's signature, and they had denied it with the cold explanation that the surgery was classified as elective rather than urgent, a classification Delaney knew was medically wrong, but profitable in every way that mattered to them. She had appealed. They denied it again. She had sat in the hospital social worker's office and listened as someone suggested she start an online fundraiser put Tad's story on the internet with photographs of him lying in a hospital bed so strangers might pity him enough to donate, and Delaney had politely refused. Not because she looked down on people who did that, but because something inside her, that stubborn pride she had forged over 28 years of living in a world that had always looked at her as a problem to be pitied, wouldn't allow her to turn her brother's pain into a performance for compassion. She didn't want anyone to feel sorry for the Hale family. She wanted people to respect it. And that very pride, the thing that had helped her survive so many years, had pushed her into a decision she was now beginning to dimly understand had been a mistake. When every legitimate door had closed, she had gone to a woman named Desmond, a private lender operating on the edge of the harbor district, whom an old coworker had whispered about to her in a moment of desperation. Someone willing to hand over quick cash to people the banks had turned away. Delaney had borrowed $40,000 to pay the deposit that would hold Tad's surgery date, and Ms. Desmond had smiled as she handed over the money, with a politeness that made Delaney feel more uneasy than reassured, along with an interest rate Delaney knew was brutal but had signed for because she had no other choice. She hadn't known who Desmond truly worked for. She hadn't known that the threat of debt was quietly tying her to something far larger than a shipyard and a steel beam. Lying in the hospital bed, Delaney did what she had always done whenever the weight of everything threatened to crush her. She applied the rules she had made for herself when she was still a girl, the 5-minute rule, allowing herself to feel every bit of fear and despair for exactly 5 minutes, no more, and then after that, to pick it up and keep moving. She looked at the wall clock, counted silently in the absolute quiet that only she knew, and when the 5 minutes had passed, she drew a deep breath, folded the surgeon's note once more, and told herself that whoever the man in the operating room was, at least today she had saved one life, even though she still didn't know how she was going to save her brother. She had no idea that the answer to that question, in a way she could never have foreseen, was sleeping in that very operating room upstairs. They moved Delaney up to an overnight observation room on the 3rd floor to monitor her concussion, a small room with a rectangular glass window in the door, looking out onto the hallway, and she had drifted off in bone-deep exhaustion until something pulled her awake at 2:47 in the morning, the number she read on the phone screen beside her bed. It wasn't a sound that woke her, because for Delaney sound had never been able to do that, but a shift in the air, something her body had learned to recognize over 24 years of living in silence, the feeling that heavy objects were moving very close by. She lay still, eyes open in the dim darkness, and began reading the world in the only way she knew. There were footsteps in the hallway, and she felt them through the tile floor as they traveled up into the bed frame, and these footsteps were entirely different from the familiar rhythm of the night nurses on duty that she had memorized by heart. They were heavier, slower, spaced at even intervals in the way of large men trained to move with purpose. There was more than one person. She could feel it through the way the vibrations overlapped, through the small waves coming from several directions at once. Then the pressure in her room changed faintly, that vague stopped-up feeling people had in their ears when a door somewhere had just opened and closed, and she knew someone had entered the hallway from the stairwell. Delaney sat up very slowly, holding back the hiss in her throat as her knees and forearm protested, then edged closer to the glass window and looked out. What she saw should have frightened her, but strangely, it didn't. There were 3 men in the hallway, all of them large, wearing dark black suits tailored in that fitted way cheap suits could never imitate, and they stood in positions that she, with a lifetime sharpened eye for observation, immediately recognized as not random at all. One man stood beside the elevator, one stood near the emergency exit, and one stood straight across from her room, his back against the wall, both arms folded over his chest, his eyes sweeping the hallway in a steady rhythm. They didn't behave like intruders, not sneaking, not rushing. They behaved like men who had been assigned to stand guard and were carrying out that duty with cold discipline. The man closest to her room was the oldest of them, perhaps in his 40s, with a calm, square face and the eyes of someone who had seen many things and no longer startled easily. And it was that composure, that quiet authority radiating from the way he stood, that made Delaney understand he was in command of the other 2. She didn't know his name, but she would soon learn it was Bronson Keel. She watched them for a long time through the glass, and the longer she looked, the more she realized something that made her heart slow instead of race, that these men weren't directing their vigilance toward her room, as though she were a threat, but outward, toward the elevator, toward the stairwell, toward any path from which danger might come. They weren't guarding her like a prisoner. They were protecting her like something precious. And that realization, instead of reassuring her, awakened in her a deeper and colder question. Because what could an ordinary emergency room nurse, a woman drowning in debt with a bedridden younger brother, possibly have that was worth 3 men in expensive suits standing guard all night in a community hospital? The man she had pulled from the wreckage rose in her mind, the blood-soaked tailored suit, the aura of power that still clung to him, even when he was half-conscious. And for the first time, Delaney began to understand that she hadn't simply saved the life of some stranger, but had perhaps stepped, without knowing it, across a threshold into a world with its own rules, rules she had never been taught how to read. She moved back from the window, lay down again, and in that silent darkness, she felt the presence of the men standing guard through the floor until it was nearly dawn, unable to fall asleep again. By mid-morning, after the doctor had confirmed that her concussion was only mild, and signed her discharge papers with instructions to rest, for a few days, Delaney took a taxi back to her apartment in an old working-class neighborhood on the south side of Providence, where smoke-stained red brick buildings stood, pressed close together, and the rent was cheap enough that she could pay it while still sending most of her paycheck toward Tad's debt. When the taxi turned onto her familiar street, the driver suddenly slowed down and blurted out something Delaney couldn't hear but could read on his open mouth in the rearview mirror. "What the hell is this?" And she lifted her head to follow his gaze. In front of her building, lined up in a long, perfectly straight row along the curb that was usually empty, were 10 black sport utility vehicles, gleaming, identical, their windows so dark no one could see inside, their engines idling softly and breathing thin streams of exhaust into the cold morning air. Delaney had been warned about this moment in her own way, because all through the night, the shadows of men in black suits, guarding the hospital hallway, had planted in her a premonition that the world of the man she had saved wouldn't leave her alone. So when she saw that line of vehicles, what she felt wasn't pure surprise, but the cold crawl along her spine of a foreboding that had just been confirmed. She paid the taxi fare, stepped out on legs that were still trembling, and stood on the sidewalk facing the line of cars while the driver sped away as fast as he possibly could. Around her, the neighborhood held its breath. She felt it more than saw it, in the way curtains at the upstairs windows shifted slightly and then hurriedly closed, in the figure of the old neighbor woman, who usually sat outside for fresh air, now vanished behind a tightly shut door, in the sudden stillness of a street where, at this hour, children should have been riding bicycles, and adults should have been leaving for work. This whole working-class neighborhood understood perfectly that vehicles like these never brought good news, and they had chosen the safest thing to do, to pretend they hadn't seen anything. The door of the lead vehicle opened, and the man who stepped out was the very man Delaney had watched all through the night through the glass window, the older one with the calm square face, Bronson Keel, though she still didn't know his name. He didn't hurry toward her. He closed the car door gently, fastened one button of his suit jacket, and crossed the street with the same slow, deliberate steps she had felt through the hospital floor the night before, and every step he took carried the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make others pay attention, because his danger lay hidden beneath his courtesy like deep water, moving beneath a sheet of smooth ice. He stopped a few steps from her, close enough for her to read his lips, but far enough not to make her feel cornered, and that subtlety caught Delaney's attention, because very few strangers knew how to keep the proper distance from a deaf person. "Miss Hale," he said, his lips moving clearly and slowly, as if he had been told in advance that she read lips. "I apologize for disturbing you on a morning like this. The man you helped yesterday would like to express his gratitude." Then he slipped one hand inside his suit jacket and took out 2 things, a thick cream-colored card printed with only a phone number and no name, and a full, heavy envelope that Delaney didn't need to open to know what was inside, because the way it sat with weight in his hand when he offered it told her everything. He placed both in her unbandaged palm, with the same solemnity Mavis had used when handing over the note the night before. But this time there was an entirely different weight to it, the weight of money and of the invisible obligations that came with it. Delaney stood there on the sidewalk, in the middle of her breathless neighborhood, with the envelope in her hand and 10 black vehicles waiting silently behind the man. And she understood that she was standing before a crossroads, and that, whatever she did next, would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Delaney lowered her gaze to the envelope resting in her palm, felt its weight. And for one brief moment she allowed the most exhausted and desperate part of herself to think of Tad, of the $40,000 debt pressing down on her, of the $187,000 surgery she had no idea how to manage, and of the fact that the money inside this thick envelope alone might be enough to let her breathe for many months. But then she lifted her head, and the pride that had been forged in her over 28 years, the part of her that had refused fundraising pages and pitying eyes, spoke louder than everything else. She held the envelope out and returned it to Bronson, placing it in his hand with a finality that allowed no argument, and said in her own voice, the voice she had trained through years of speech therapy, imperfect but clear and steady, "I don't save people for money." Bronson looked down at the envelope in his hand, then looked back at her. And for the first time since he had stepped out of the car, something passed across his calm face, not irritation, but a new kind of attention, as though she had just done something very few people he had ever met had dared to do. He didn't try to insist. A man accustomed to using money to open every door must have been used to people snatching envelopes with both hands, and the fact that Delaney handed it back forced him to look at her differently, longer and more carefully. She said nothing more, only held his gaze, because she had learned very early that in a world where people often assumed her silence was a sign of weakness, holding someone's eyes was the strongest way to say she wasn't afraid, she wasn't powerless. She was a woman who had done what she believed was right, and she didn't need to be paid for it. Bronson slowly slipped the envelope back inside his suit jacket, and when he did, the gesture carried a strange respect, as though he were acknowledging that the money had no place here. "Keep the card," he said, his lips moving slowly, "not because of money. The man you saved is someone who very rarely owes anyone anything, and he isn't used to the feeling of owing a debt he's not allowed to repay. He wants to meet you, only to thank you in his own way." Delaney weighed those words in her own silence, and she realized that this invitation wasn't like the envelope. It wasn't a bribe, but something more personal, and therefore more dangerous. Every cautious instinct in her told her she should refuse, should turn around, walk into the building, lock the door, and pretend this morning had never happened, because she had sensed enough of the world of these black vehicles to know that stepping deeper into it was the least wise thing she could do. But something else spoke inside her too, a stubborn curiosity mingled with the unfinished feeling that she had saved a person without even knowing who he was, without knowing whether he had survived the surgery, and that if she turned away now, that story would forever remain a question hanging inside her. She looked at the card in her hand, the nameless phone number printed on the cream-colored paper, then looked back at Bronson, and she didn't answer right away, didn't nod too quickly, didn't let her desperation for money decide for her. "I'll think about it," she said, and that was all she gave him, not a promise, not an easy agreement. Bronson nodded, and in that nod was the acceptance of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. "When you're ready, call that number," he said, then turned and crossed the street back toward the line of vehicles, and one by one, the 10 black cars rolled away in a silence. Delaney felt through the soles of her feet, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk with a card and a question heavier than any envelope. It took Delaney 3 days to call the number on the card, 3 days in which she struggled between caution and curiosity, between fear of the world of black cars and the need to know who the man she had saved truly was. And when she finally pressed call, a car came to pick her up that very afternoon, carrying her away from the smoke-stained red brick streets of Providence and along the coastline south toward Newport, where old mansions from America's golden age stood in solemn silence gazing out at the Atlantic. The car turned through a towering iron gate and rolled down a long gravel drive that stretched between 2 rows of trees, leading to a massive gray stone house with tall windows and thick walls that carried the quiet wealth of money that had survived for generations. Bronson met her at the door and led her through marble-floored corridors, beneath dark oil paintings and unlit crystal chandeliers, and Delaney felt the stillness of the place through the soles of her feet, a dense, controlled stillness, entirely different from the natural silence of her own life. He brought her into a broad study with bookshelves rising to the ceiling and a stone fireplace burning, and there, seated in a high-backed leather armchair beside the fire, was the man she had pulled from the flames. This time he was fully conscious, and that made everything different. One of his arms was in a sling, a line of stitches ran along his temple, and he sat with the careful stillness of a man in pain, who refused to let that pain show. But what drew Delaney's attention most wasn't his injuries. It was his eyes. They were cold gray eyes, the eyes of a man used to watching the world as if it were a chessboard. Eyes that measured every person who entered his field of vision the way other men measured numbers. And when those eyes turned toward her, Delaney had the feeling that she was being read, assessed, and classified by a sharp and unforgiving intelligence. He was Warwick Fontaine, 37 years old, though at that moment she still didn't fully know who he was or how great his power truly was. She only felt it radiating from the way he sat, from the way the whole room seemed to revolve around his quiet presence. He motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him, and when she sat, he picked up a small whiteboard and a marker that had already been placed on the side table, and Delaney immediately understood that he had prepared for this meeting, that he knew she read lips and wrote, that he had arranged everything so she could communicate in her own way. It was a small but deliberate respect, the kind she rarely encountered. He wrote on the board in firm, neat handwriting, "You saved my life," and pushed it toward her. Delaney answered with her own voice, "I only did what anyone should do," and Warwick slowly shook his head, wiped the board clean, and wrote again, "No, not anyone." More than a dozen people stood and watched. Only you stepped forward. As he wrote, Bronson stood in the corner, now and then lifting his hands in clumsy but earnest signs, adding to what Warwick had written, and Delaney understood that this older man had taken the trouble to learn a few basic signs just so this conversation could unfold more smoothly for her. A small detail that stirred something quietly in her heart. Warwick watched the exchange between her and Bronson with sharp eyes that missed nothing, then wrote a new question. "You didn't take the money. Why?" Delaney looked straight at him and answered, "Because some things shouldn't have a price. A human life is one of them." A long silence followed those words, and in that silence Delaney saw Warwick's gray eyes change almost imperceptibly, not softening, but deepening, as though she had spoken something that touched a place he hadn't allowed himself to think about in a long time. He set the marker down for a moment and only looked at her, and Delaney felt the weight of that gaze, not as a threat, but as reluctant recognition, the recognition of a man who had believed that everyone and everything could be bought, now sitting across from living proof that he had been wrong. Then he picked up the marker again and wrote a sentence that made an involuntary chill pass through her. "I need to talk to you about what you saw that day. Not about the fire. About the car that drove away." Before Delaney could answer the question about the car that had driven away, Warwick set the marker down and reached for a thin file already placed on the table beside his chair. And when he opened it, Delaney realized with a coldness slowly spreading through her body that the pages inside were about her. He didn't hand it to her right away, but took the whiteboard, wrote a line, and pushed it toward her. "Before we talk, I want you to know that I looked into you. I never owe a person I don't understand." Delaney felt anger rise faintly inside her, the violated feeling of someone who had long been used to others assuming they had the right to know the private details of her life, and she wrote back on that very same board in a firm hand, "You had no right." Warwick read it, nodded in acknowledgement, then wrote, "You're right. But what I found means I have to tell you, because it concerns your safety." He turned through the file and began, through handwritten lines mixed with a few clumsy signs from Bronson in the corner of the room, to draw before her a picture she had been living inside but had never seen in full. He knew about Tad, about the accident at the shipyard, about the injured spine and the $187,000 surgery the insurance company had refused to cover. He knew about the $40,000 debt. And then he wrote a name that made Delaney's heart stop for a beat, Desmond. "You know the woman who lent you money is named Desmond," he wrote. "But do you know who Desmond works for?" Delaney shook her head, and Warwick looked at her for a long moment before writing again, as if weighing how much he should reveal, then lowered the marker and wrote a second name, Veasley. The woman who lent you money isn't an independent lender. She's a link in an organization run by a man named Otto Veasley, and Veasley is the one who ordered the car to run me off the road that day. Delaney read the line twice, then 3 times, and felt the floor beneath her seem to tilt, because the meaning of it slowly emerged with brutal clarity. She had borrowed money from the very people who had just tried to kill the man she had saved. The threat of debt she had thought was only a private matter between herself and a suspiciously polite lender turned out to be a cord tying her to one side of a war she hadn't even known existed. Warwick watched that awareness spread across her face with gray eyes that never moved away, and he wrote, "Do you understand your position now? You owe money to my enemy, and you saved my life. In my world, those two things can't exist together without consequences." Delaney sat still, both hands clenched in her lap, trying to rearrange everything in her mind. She thought of Ms. Desmond's courteous smile when she had handed over the stack of cash, the smile that had unsettled her without her understanding why, and now she understood. It had been the smile of a spider watching prey settle into the web. She wrote on the board, her hand trembling slightly, "I don't know anything about your business with Veasley. I only needed money to save my brother." Warwick nodded slowly, and this time there was something in his eyes close to understanding. "I know," he wrote. "That's exactly what makes this complicated. You're not my enemy, Miss Hale. But you're standing between two families that want to destroy each other, and you stepped into that position without knowing it, only because you did 2 things, borrowed from the wrong person and saved the wrong person." Delaney looked at him, then looked toward the fire moving silently in the hearth, and for the first time since the morning she had seen the 10 black cars, she fully felt that there was no way back to her old life anymore, that the door into this world had closed behind her, from the moment she stepped toward the flames, instead of running away like everyone else. 2 days after the meeting in Newport, just as Delaney had left the hospital after her afternoon visit with Tad, a man she had never seen before approached her in the parking lot, and from the way he moved, upright and purposeful, but without the heavy authority of the men in black suits, she immediately guessed that he belonged to a different kind of power. He held up a badge for her to read and turned so the afternoon light fell across his face, a gesture showing that he had been told in advance that she read lips. "Special Agent Prescott Whitlock, Federal Bureau of Investigation." His lips moved clearly. "I need to speak with you for a few minutes, Miss Hale." Delaney stood still, guarded, and Whitlock didn't waste time circling the point. He was a man close to 40, with the tired face of someone who had been chasing one target for far too long, and he told her that his agency had been watching the Fontaine family for many years, that they knew about the attack on the Harbor Road, and that they knew she was the one who had pulled Warwick Fontaine out of the burning car. "Do you know who you saved?" Whitlock asked, and when Delaney didn't answer, he answered for her. "He runs one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New England, controls much of the cargo moving through this harbor, and his hands are stained with more blood than you can imagine." Delaney felt a painful conflict begin to twist inside her, because the man she had met in Newport, the man who had prepared a whiteboard for her, the man whose bodyguard had learned sign language just to speak with her, didn't fully match the portrait Whitlock was painting, and at the same time, she also knew that a man couldn't have 10 black cars and a mansion in Newport while keeping his hands completely clean. Whitlock stepped a little closer and said what he had been waiting to say. "We believe you witnessed something at the scene, something that could help us, and with your exceptional powers of observation, your testimony may be the missing piece we've needed for years. I need you to be a witness." Delaney took a step back, shook her head, and quickly wrote in the notebook she always carried, "I only saved a dying man. I have nothing to do with your affairs." But Whitlock had been prepared for that answer, and what he did next sent a chill down Delaney's spine, because he took out a file and said, "I know about your brother, Thaddeus. I know about the surgery he needs, and I know you borrowed money from people you should never have become involved with in order to pay for it." He let that sentence hang there for a moment before continuing. "If you cooperate with us, there are witness protection programs, federal resources that could help take care of your brother, that could get you and him beyond the reach of both Fontaine and Veasley." Delaney looked at him, and she understood exactly what he was doing. He was using her greatest desperation, her brother's life and his ability to walk, as leverage, placing her conscience on one side of the scale and Tad's future on the other. It was a trap carefully woven out of false kindness, and its cruelty lay in the fact that it wasn't entirely a lie. He really could help Tad, and that was exactly what made it so hard to refuse. She stood in the parking lot beneath the fading afternoon light, torn between two worlds pulling her in opposite directions. On one side was a man she had saved, a man who had treated her with a rare kind of respect but lived by blood-soaked rules she couldn't simply ignore. On the other side was the law, the thing that looked right on paper, but offered to her by a man willing to use her bedridden brother as a chess piece. She gave Whitlock no answer. She took the business card he offered, slipped it into her coat pocket beside Warwick's cream-colored card, 2 pieces of paper from 2 worlds now lying side by side in the same pocket, and walked away without promising anything, carrying with her a question heavier than ever, which was truly right when both choices made her feel as though she were losing a part of herself, to betray the man who had placed his trust in her, or to stay silent and let justice slip out of reach. That night, Delaney couldn't sleep, and as she lay in her dark apartment, listening to the world through the vague vibrations rising from the street below, her mind kept returning again and again to the moment on the harbor road that she had tried to forget, not the flames or the weight of the man she had dragged across the pavement, but something else, a small detail that had been buried beneath panic and pain, and hadn't surfaced until Agent Whitlock had carelessly said that she might have witnessed something. She closed her eyes and let her memory do what it had always done better than the memory of ordinary people. Because a person who had spent her whole life reading lips and watching had learned to remember the world in sharp edges and the movements of other people's mouths, in a way people who could hear never had to consider. She turned back to the moment before she had rushed toward the wreckage, when she had just stepped out of her car, and the smoke had not yet swallowed her view, and there, in her memory, appeared the image of the black car that had rammed Warwick off the road, the car reversing to flee. Through the side window as it passed, for only 1 or 2 seconds, she had seen the face of a man sitting in the back seat, one hand pressing a 2-way radio to his ear while his mouth was moving, saying something into the device. At the time, she hadn't paid attention. Her mind had been entirely fixed on the man trapped in the fire, but her eyes, the eyes trained all her life to read words from the motion of lips without needing sound, had recorded that image and stored it in some chamber of memory that she was now opening. She focused, reconstructing each frame one by one, trying to read the moving lips of the man in the car again as though she were replaying a silent film in slow motion. A few words emerged clearly, a few remained blurred, but it was enough for her to understand that the man hadn't been panicking, like someone who had just caused an accident. He had been calmly reporting, confirming something to someone on the other end, and that calmness was what made it terrifying. Delaney opened her eyes in the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it striking her ribs, because she had just realized a truth that turned her whole body cold. She wasn't simply an accidental witness who had happened to be at the scene. She was the only person in the world who had seen and could read the words the mastermind had spoken in the very moment the attack was carried out. And in a world where everyone else had to rely on sound, on secondhand testimony, on evidence that could be denied, she held something no one else possessed, a living recording carved into the memory of a woman who could read lips. She thought of Warwick, who wanted to know who had truly ordered the attack on him. She thought of Veasley, who would surely pay any price to silence the only person who had seen. She thought of Whitlock and the federal agency, the people who had been hunting this truth for years without being able to grasp it. All 3 sides needed what she was holding inside her head, and that realization didn't make her feel powerful. It made her feel hunted, because a piece of information that 3 dangerous forces all craved turned the person holding it into the most valuable thing, and at the same time the easiest one to eliminate. She sat up in the darkness, wrapped her arms around her knees, and understood that the silence that had followed her all her life, the thing the world had always treated as her flaw, had now made her the most dangerous witness all 3 sides had ever faced, and she still had no idea that the fragment she had just stirred awake in her memory contained a truth far darker than anything she could imagine. The next morning, Delaney called the number on the cream-colored card, and this time it wasn't out of curiosity, but because she knew she needed help, understanding the very thing she was holding inside her head. And within 1 hour, Bronson was standing at the door of her apartment, alone, without the line of black cars behind him, only a calm man with a notebook and pen ready to listen. She invited him in, and they sat across from each other at the small dining table, where she had already spread out a large sheet of paper and divided it into 2 columns with a marker. At the top of one column, she wrote certain, and at the top of the other, she wrote possible. That was how she had learned to handle every complicated problem throughout her life, separating what she knew clearly from what she could only guess, because a person who couldn't trust her ears had to trust her own precision. Bronson observed that method with quiet respect, and through exchanged written lines and a few clumsy signs from him, they began reconstructing the scene piece by piece. In the certain column, Delaney wrote what she didn't doubt at all, that there had been a man sitting in the back seat of the black car, that he had held a 2-way radio pressed to his ear, that he had been calm rather than panicked, that he had been reporting to someone instead of receiving orders. In the possible column, she wrote the words she had read, but wasn't entirely sure of, the blurred fragments of lips she was still trying to piece together. Bronson asked her through the notebook whether she could read what the man had said, and Delaney closed her eyes again, rebuilding the silent film in her mind, letting the man's lips in the car move slowly before her. She followed each shape of sound, each way the mouth opened and closed, each position of tongue and teeth that she had learned to decode since she was 4 years old, and little by little a sentence appeared. The man in the car had said, "Target is done," and then had stopped as though listening to the person on the other end, before speaking a second sentence that made Delaney open her eyes sharply and set the pen down, because the second sentence contained a name. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly, and wrote that name in the certain column, not because she understood what it meant, but because she was absolutely certain the man's lips had formed those exact syllables. And when Bronson read the name on the page, Delaney saw something she had never seen in this composed man in all their previous meetings. She saw him freeze. His square face, which never seemed easily shaken, went pale. The pen in his hand stopped in midair, and his eyes lifted to hers with an expression mixed with disbelief and a fear she had never seen in him before. "Are you sure?" he wrote, his handwriting no longer as neat as usual but scrawled with urgency. "Are you absolutely sure that is the name you read?" Delaney nodded and wrote, "I never mistake a name. I've read lips my whole life. That is exactly what he said." Bronson looked at the name on the paper for a long time, and she watched him trying to rearrange something in his mind, trying to fit that name into a picture where it should never have belonged, and that struggle showed clearly on his face, like a man staring at 2 pieces that couldn't possibly coexist and yet somehow had to. She didn't know who carried that name. She didn't understand why it made a seasoned man like Bronson turn pale, but she could read from his face that she had just spoken something even more explosive than she had imagined, something that didn't merely reveal who had struck, but overturned something from within. Bronson stood, folded the 2-column sheet and slipped it into his suit jacket with a care that was almost solemn, then wrote one final line in the notebook before leaving. "Don't say this name to anyone. Not Whitlock. Not anyone. Let me speak with Mr. Fontaine first." And when the door closed behind him, Delaney remained alone in the silent apartment, feeling the beat of her own heart pulsing through the tabletop, with the clear sense that the name she had just read was about to shake an entire world she had only just stepped into. That afternoon, a car came once again to take Delaney to Newport, and this time the atmosphere inside the gray stone mansion was entirely different. A dense tension she could feel the moment she crossed the threshold, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Bronson led her into the study with the fireplace, where Warwick was standing with his back to the door, looking into the flames, and when he turned around, Delaney saw on his face something she had never seen in their previous meetings. Not the familiar calculating coldness, but anger held in so tightly that it had nearly become absolute stillness. The most dangerous kind of stillness in a powerful man. Bronson placed the 2-column sheet on the table in front of Warwick, and Delaney watched the man she had saved lower his eyes to read the name she had read from the lips of the man in the car. and she observed his reaction with every bit of her ability to read people. For one moment, Warwick's face was completely motionless, like the surface of a frozen lake. Then she saw something break very faintly behind those gray eyes, not surprise, but a deep pain he immediately swallowed down and locked away. The pain of a man who had just had confirmed something that perhaps some part of him had suspected for a long time, but had never allowed himself to believe. Warwick picked up the whiteboard, and for the first time since Delaney had known him, his handwriting was no longer firm and neat, but heavy, as though every word had to be dragged through some invisible weight. "The man who bears this name," he wrote, "is Gideon Fontaine, my younger cousin, the man I trusted more than anyone else in the family." Delaney read those words and felt the whole room seem to sway around her, because suddenly every scattered piece fit together in a cruel way. The person who had ordered the attack on Warwick wasn't merely Veasley from the outside, but someone from within Warwick's own family, someone who had joined hands with the enemy to clear the way for himself to seize power. The assassination attempt on the Harbor Road wasn't simply a war between two families, but an internal betrayal disguised as an outside attack, and that was exactly why it had nearly succeeded, because no one guarded against a knife coming from the very hand they trusted. Warwick wrote again, slowly and coldly. "Gideon knew my schedule that day. Only a very small number of people knew I would be on that road at that hour. I've been asking myself for days how Veasley knew. Now I understand. He didn't need to know, because someone in my own house told him." Delaney looked at him, and she understood that what she had brought this man wasn't good news, but a wound deeper than the stitches along his temple. Because being attacked by an enemy was one thing, but being betrayed by someone you loved and trusted most was a different kind of pain entirely, the kind that never fully healed. But then she saw Warwick's gray eyes turn toward her, and a cold realization appeared in them, and he wrote a sentence that made Delaney herself shiver. "Do you understand what this means for you? You are the only person who saw and read the words Gideon gave as an order. You are the only living proof that he is the traitor. As long as you are alive and able to speak about what you saw, you are the greatest threat to him. Until now, he thought you were harmless, an accidental witness who knew nothing. But once he realizes you could read his lips from inside the car, he won't let you live." Delaney stood motionless, feeling the weight of those words descend on her, and she understood that in the moment she had read the name from the lips of the man in the car, she had turned herself from a harmless witness into a target who had to be eliminated by a man willing to kill his own flesh and blood to gain power. Warwick set the marker down, stepped closer to her, and through his eyes, through the tension locked in his jaw, Delaney read something he had not yet written, that from this second on, her safety and his war had become one, and that this man who was used to measuring everything by advantage had just decided something beyond all calculation, that he wouldn't let the man who had betrayed him touch the woman who had saved his life. Warwick wanted Delaney to stay in Newport, where she would be protected, but she refused, because Tad was still lying in a hospital in Providence, and she couldn't place her own safety above her brother's life, so Warwick did the only thing he could do. He assigned his men to stay close to both her and Tad day and night. And it turned out that decision saved both siblings' lives, because Gideon moved faster than anyone had predicted. On the second night after the meeting in Newport, Delaney was in her apartment when she sensed something wrong in the only way she could, a shift in pressure, when the door downstairs in the lobby opened out of rhythm, strange vibrations traveling up through the floor from the stairwell, heavy and hurried, completely different from the footsteps of the guards she had grown used to. She hadn't yet understood what was happening when Rory, the young bodyguard Warwick had sent to watch over her, rushed in from his post outside the hallway, his face tense, and signed urgently with both his hands and the clumsy mouth movements he had been trying to learn, "Go, right now, with me." Delaney didn't ask. She had learned to trust urgency when it showed itself, and she grabbed her coat and ran after Rory toward the rear fire escape just as she felt, through the floor, the vibrations of a violent struggle erupt in the front hallway outside her apartment, where two of Warwick's men were holding back the men Veasley had sent under Gideon's orders. She didn't hear a thing, no shouting, no breaking glass, only felt it all through waves of tremor traveling up into her feet, and that very silence made everything surreal and more terrifying, like watching a violent storm through a thick pane of glass. Rory got her down to the street, pushed her into a waiting car with the engine already running, and as the car sped away, Delaney looked back and saw flashing lights reflected in the windows of her building, signs of the chaos she had escaped by a hair. But the real fear came only when she thought of Tad, and she seized her phone, texting frantically to Warwick's man stationed at the hospital, and the reply made her heart seem to stop. Someone had tried to get near his room. Gideon, it turned out, had struck on both fronts at once, sending men to her apartment, and men to the hospital where Tad was lying, understanding that the surest way to force Delaney into silence was to threaten the one thing she could never trade away. The car changed direction and raced straight toward the hospital, and for that entire drive Delaney sat with both hands clenched until they went white, reliving all the helplessness she had endured while watching her brother lie paralyzed and being unable to do anything, now joined by the horror that he was in danger because of her. When she rushed into the hallway of Tad's ward, she saw Warwick's men had formed a protective ring around his room. The men she had once seen guarding a hospital corridor, at night now standing between her brother and the darkness reaching for him. And in that moment, Delaney understood something she would never forget, that trust in this world wasn't built from words, but from actions, from people willing to put their own bodies in front of bullets for a bedridden young man they had never known, simply because the man leading them had ordered them to protect his sister. She stepped into the room, saw that Tad was still safe, his eyes wide with fear but his body unharmed, and she wrapped her arms around him, trembling with relief. But even as she held her brother, Delaney knew this safety had been bought at a price, that somewhere out there, the people who had risked themselves for her and for Tad might be paying for that loyalty, and that the war she had accidentally stepped into was no longer Warwick's alone. It had become hers too, a war she couldn't hear, but had felt fully through every vibration beneath her feet. What Delaney didn't know, in the moment she wrapped her arms around Tad, was the price that had been paid just before she arrived. Because when Veasley's men first tried to get into the ward where Tad was lying, Rory had been the one who stopped them. She only understood the full truth when she saw Bronson standing at the end of the hallway, his usually calm square face, now marked by a pain he didn't bother to hide, and when she approached, he led her away from Tad's room to a corner of the corridor, where a stretcher was being covered with a white sheet. Delaney stopped walking, and a coldness spread through her body, before Bronson had time to write anything at all. She recognized the small, silver pin shaped like a hawk on his lapel, the same one she had noticed earlier that day when he had pushed her into the car and helped her escape the apartment, now resting motionless beneath the white sheet. Rory hadn't stayed with her. After getting her to safety, he had returned to the hospital when he heard that Tad had been targeted, and he had stood between the door of Tad's room and the men who came for him, and he had fallen there, on the floor of a community hospital, so that a paralyzed 19-year-old young man he had never even spoken to could go on living. Bronson wrote in the notebook with slow handwriting. He was only 26. He was the first one to volunteer for the assignment to protect you, from that night at the hospital. He said he had never met anyone who would run into fire the way you did. Delaney read those lines and felt something inside her chest break open, not in loud sobbing, but in a silent, bottomless pain, the very silence that had followed her, all her life now becoming the shape of loss. She knelt beside the stretcher, placed her still bandaged hand on the white sheet covering the young man who had died for her brother, and thought of the clumsy signs he had tried to learn, just so he could tell her one simple thing, "Come with me," and she thought that he had died while still learning how to speak to her. And that thought sent tears slipping silently onto the sheet. She didn't cry out loud, she never had. But that didn't make her grief any smaller. It only lived somewhere deeper than words, in the same place where she had stored every loss of her life. A little while later, she sensed a presence beside her through the shift in the air, and when she looked up, she saw Warwick had arrived, standing over the stretcher with a face hard as stone, but with gray eyes reflecting the hallway lights in a wet glimmer he refused to let fall. Delaney understood that for a man like Warwick, every person in his organization wasn't a nameless pawn, but someone he had chosen and taken responsibility for, and Rory's death was a wound he would carry with him, a blood debt he would never forget. In that moment, standing in the hospital hallway beside the body of the young man who had sacrificed himself for her family, Delaney made the decision she had still been hesitating over until now. She had been torn between Warwick and Whitlock, between two worlds pulling her in opposite directions, not knowing whom to trust. But now, seeing Warwick's man had bled to protect Tad, seeing the real pain in the eyes of the man she had saved, she understood that the loyalty and protection she had received from this world weren't false or part of some scheme, but had been paid for with real lives. She rose, faced Warwick, and for the first time she didn't write, didn't sign through an interpreter, but looked straight into his eyes and spoke in her own voice. Steady though quiet, I trust you. Tell me what I have to do. And in Warwick's slow nod, in the way he placed his uninjured hand on her shoulder, for one brief moment and then withdrew it, Delaney felt that something had just been sealed between them. Not by a promise, but by blood and by the shared grief they had both just carried. After that night, Warwick brought both Delaney and Tad back to Newport, where Tad was cared for by a private medical team and guarded more carefully than anywhere else could have managed. And for the first time since disaster had struck, Delaney was able to sleep without staying alert to every strange vibration beneath the floor. The fires passed in this tense stillness of a mansion waiting for a storm, and during that time Delaney began to see another side of the man she had saved. Not the cold family boss who measured people, but a man quietly doing something she hadn't expected. One evening, while she sat alone in the library looking out at the darkened sea, Warwick stepped in, and instead of taking up the familiar whiteboard or waiting for Bronson to come and interpret, he stopped in front of her, and then, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, like a man newly learning, he raised both hands and began to sign. His movements weren't perfect, his fingers sometimes finding the wrong position so that he had to stop and correct himself. But Delaney could read clearly what he was saying. You're safe, I promise. She sat motionless, because she understood the full meaning of that moment in a way hearing people never fully could. All her life, Delaney had been used to people speaking to her through something in between, through paper and pen, through interpreters, through reluctant patience or worse, through pity, and it was rare for anyone to step into her silent world instead of forever forcing her to reach outward toward their noisy one. But this powerful man, the man around whose every word an entire empire seemed to turn, had taken the time to learn her language, had placed the hands that were used to giving orders and signing blood-stained contracts into the awkward shapes of signs, just so he could tell her one sentence without anyone else standing between them. It wasn't a showy gesture. There was no one else in the room to witness it, and that very privacy gave it even greater weight. Delaney signed back, "When did you learn?" And Warwick answered slowly, "Every night after you fell asleep. Bronson taught me. I'm not good." She smiled faintly, the first real smile she had given in many days, and signed, "You're better than you think." A silence settled between them, the kind of silence that had never been emptiness to Delaney, but had always been a space full of things that didn't need to be spoken aloud. And inside that silence she felt something beginning to form between her and this man, something both warm and dangerous, because she didn't forget for even 1 second that they came from two worlds that could not be reconciled. He was a man whose hands had been stained by things she could never accept, a man who lived by rules, opposed to everything she believed as someone who had spent her life caring for people and saving them, and she was someone whose integrity and pride wouldn't allow her to turn a blind eye to those things, even as her heart was quietly leaning toward him. She realized that whatever was growing between them stood on a strange foundation, not ordinary romance, but deep respect, that rare feeling of two people who were used to being misunderstood by the world, finally being truly seen by another person. Warwick was the first person who didn't look at her silence as a flaw to be pitied, but as part of who she was, even as a strength. And perhaps she was the first person to see through the cold, ruthless shell around him and reach the man who still knew pain, still knew loss, still knew how to value a decent thing. But even as she felt that, Delaney kept a clear distance inside herself, because she knew there was still a mountain between them that couldn't yet be crossed, and that before anything could truly begin, she would have to face the question of whether she could love a man whose world demanded prices her conscience would never be willing to pay. Rory's death changed something in the way Delaney saw this war, and when Warwick laid out his plan, she no longer hesitated about which side she stood on, though she still held firmly to her own boundaries. Warwick understood that confronting Gideon directly with violence would only ignite an all-out war that would leave even more people dead. And more importantly, it would never expose Gideon's betrayal in a way he couldn't deny. So he chose a more subtle path, a trap laid back against the very man who had laid one for him. The plan rested on two pillars, and both revolved around what Delaney carried. The first pillar was the law, and this was where Warwick did something she hadn't expected. He reached out to Agent Whitlock himself. Delaney was in the room when the exchange took place, and she understood the cold wisdom in that move, because Warwick knew Whitlock had been hunting the Fontaine family for many years, and he offered the agent the thing he wanted most. Not Warwick himself, but Gideon, the traitor who had joined hands with Veasley. Delaney's testimony, legally recorded in the presence of attorneys, and handled through the proper procedure so it could be used as evidence in court, would be the crucial link. She was the witness who had directly read the order from the lips of the man in the car. And when that testimony was combined with the other evidence Whitlock had gathered over many years, it would create a case strong enough to prosecute Gideon for masterminding attempted murder and colluding with Veasley's criminal organization. Whitlock, who had originally wanted to use Delaney to bring down Warwick, now realized that the larger and cleaner target in legal terms was Gideon, and he agreed, though he still kept in his heart the intention of going after Fontaine another day. The second pillar was the underworld, where the law could not reach, and there Warwick used the rules of his own world. Within the Fontaine family and the allied families, there existed a council, a kind of internal court where disputes and betrayals were judged by an old code of honor, and betrayal from within, joining with an enemy to assassinate the head of the family, was the gravest crime of all. Warwick planned to summon the council and present the evidence of Gideon's betrayal in front of everyone, so that Gideon would not only be punished by the law, but also rejected by the very world he wanted to rule. The subtlety of the plan lay in the fact that Warwick would let Gideon walk into the trap on his own. He deliberately allowed certain signals to surface, making Gideon believe Warwick still didn't know who the traitor was, and was still suspecting Veasley from the outside, luring him into revealing himself and making another move, this time under surveillance he knew nothing about. Delaney watched Warwick arrange every piece with an intelligence so sharp it both impressed and chilled her, because she realized that the same mind that had learned sign language to say one gentle sentence to her in the night was also the mind coldly weaving a trap that could destroy his own blood relative. That was the double nature of the world she had stepped into, and she didn't allow herself to forget it. But she also set her own condition, and Warwick listened, that she would testify only to exactly what she had seen and read, no more and no less, that she wouldn't invent or embellish anything to serve his war, that her testimony belonged to the truth and not to any side. Warwick looked at her for a long time, and then nodded, and in that nod was respect for a person who still kept her integrity intact in the middle of a world built on lies. When every piece had fallen into place, when Whitlock had prepared the legal side, and Warwick had finished setting the trap on the underworld side, Delaney felt tension rising through the mansion like a violin string, stretched so tight it was about to snap, and she knew the final confrontation was very near. The trap was set at an abandoned warehouse in the harbor district, where Warwick arranged to meet Gideon under the pretense of an urgent meeting to discuss how to deal with Veasley, and Delaney should not have been there. But she had pleaded with Warwick to let her come along, because she was the only one who could confirm with her own eyes that the man who stepped into the warehouse was the same man whose lips she had read, and she was hidden safely in an observation room above with Bronson, where Whitlock's federal agents had also already positioned themselves to record everything and wait for the right moment. When Gideon arrived, Delaney looked down through the glass and recognized his figure immediately, and a cold sensation ran along her spine when she saw him walk through the warehouse with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The conversation below unfolded with tight tension, Warwick guiding it calmly, letting Gideon slowly expose himself. And then the decisive moment came when Warwick placed the 2-column sheet Delaney had written on the table and told his cousin to his face that he knew everything. Delaney watched Gideon's face change through the glass, from confidence to shock and then to naked cruelty as the mask fell away, and he no longer denied anything, but admitted it all with a contemptuous smile, saying that Warwick had grown too soft to lead, that the family needed someone willing to do the things Warwick didn't dare to do, and that he should have died on the harbor road that day. It was in that moment of Gideon's confession, when all the attention of the people below was fixed on the verbal confrontation between the two kinsmen, that Delaney sensed something no one else noticed. Through the warehouse floor, through the old wooden planks carrying vibrations all the way up to the observation room where she stood, she felt a new rhythm of footsteps, light and stealthy, coming from a hidden corner behind Warwick where he could not see. Gideon had not come alone. He had hidden a gunman in reserve, and that man was now quietly moving into position to shoot Warwick from behind the moment the conversation ended. No one below heard those footsteps amid the tension of the confrontation. None of the men who were used to relying on their hearing recognized the danger closing in from the darkness. Only Delaney, who read the world through vibrations beneath her feet, felt it. She had no time to weigh her choices, no time to call out or signal anyone. She simply did what instinct told her was right, just as she had on the day she had run into the fire. She slammed both palms hard against the observation glass and then against the floor, pouring all her strength into creating a tremor and a sound that, though she couldn't hear it, she knew would echo through the enclosed space of the warehouse, an urgent warning signal. Warwick, who had been told by Delaney in advance how she sensed the world, understood at once that she was warning him about something he could not see, and he reacted instantly. Twisting aside at the exact moment the gunman hidden in the darkness fired, and the bullet that had been meant for his back only grazed his shoulder. Chaos erupted below. Warwick's men and Whitlock's agents immediately overwhelmed the gunman and subdued Gideon before he could escape, and his entire confession, including his admission that he had ordered the assassination attempt and colluded with Veasley, had been fully recorded as evidence. Delaney stood in the observation room, both hands still pressed against the cold glass, her body trembling from the aftershock of what had just happened, and below her she saw Warwick lift his head and search for her through the glass, and in his eyes she read something far beyond gratitude, the recognition that she had just saved his life a second time, and this time not with the strength of her hands, but with the very sense the world had treated all her life as her defect. With Gideon arrested and his confession in federal hands, Veasley's network also began to collapse, because without the insider clearing the path, without the alliance from within, the empire Otto Vesley had built to swallow the Fontaine family lost its most important support, and began to fall apart under the simultaneous pressure of the law and of the underworld, which despised traitors above all else. The weeks that followed passed in the slow rhythm of healing, and Delaney learned that the end of a storm didn't mean everything immediately became perfect, only that people were allowed to breathe again. Gideon was held in custody awaiting trial with a strong prosecution file, and Veasley's network continued to crack under waves of federal investigation. But Delaney knew the underworld never truly disappeared entirely. It only changed shape, and she didn't allow herself to believe in a fairy tale ending where all evil was swept clean. What mattered more to her was Tad. The spinal surgery she had once desperately tried to find a way to pay for was finally performed, and this was where Warwick did something Delaney would always remember, because he understood her well enough to know that if he simply paid the bill, as a gift handed down from above, she would refuse, exactly as she had refused the envelope that first morning, so he didn't turn it into a debt of gratitude hanging over her head. Instead, he first arranged for the $40,000 debt she had borrowed from Veasley's organization to be erased, because with the collapse of that network, the cord binding her to it dissolved as well, and that wasn't a favor, but the removal of an injustice that his own world had indirectly caused her. Then, with Tad's surgery, he did something larger and far more meaningful. He created a fund, and he named it the Clear Signal Fund, taking its meaning from what Delaney herself was, a person capable of receiving the one important signal amid all the noise of the world. The fund was established to pay for sign language interpreters and hearing assistance devices in community hospitals across the region, poor places like the very hospital where Delaney had once worked, so that no deaf patient would ever again have to endure the feeling of being treated like a problem that needed translation instead of a human being. Tad's surgery was paid for, through that same fund, not as a special privilege reserved for his sister, But as the first case among the many people, the fund would go on to help. And that difference, subtle as it was, meant more to Delaney than all the money in the world. Because it gave her and her brother the thing she had always longed for more than help, and that was dignity. She wasn't someone being granted charity because she was pitiful. She was the person who had inspired something that would help countless others. When Tad began his first physical therapy sessions, Delaney sat beside him in the training room and watched her brother struggle to rise between two parallel bars, one trembling step at a time, his face tightening with effort, but his eyes shining with a determination she recognized, because it was the same stubbornness that ran in the blood of the Hale family. The recovery process was slow and full of pain, the doctors careful not to promise a complete recovery, and Delaney accepted that uncertainty the way she had always accepted the bare truths of life. But every small step Tad managed to take was a real victory, not a miracle but the result of labor and will. Warwick came to the therapy room from time to time, standing quietly at the far end to watch, and Delaney noticed that a silent respect was beginning to form between him and Tad as well. The powerful man never acted superior toward the bedridden young man, but watched him fight with sincere admiration. One afternoon, when Tad walked the full length of the parallel bars for the first time without collapsing, he turned to look for his sister, and Delaney stood and clapped, and though she couldn't hear the sound of her own hands, she felt that joy spread through her whole body like light, and she understood that this was the true victory, not the collapse of criminal empires, but this simple moment, her brother learning how to walk again. The official launch of the Clear Signal Fund was held on an autumn afternoon in a spacious hall in Providence, and Delaney stood on the stage with Tad seated in his wheelchair beside her, though by then he could stand on his own for short stretches, and before her was a crowd of nurses, doctors, families of deaf patients, and people the fund had helped during its first months. When she finished her brief speech, delivered in the very voice she had spent her whole life training, with a sign language interpreter standing beside her, the entire hall rose to applaud, and Delaney couldn't hear a single sound in that ovation, but she felt it fully in her own way. Through the wooden floor of the stage beneath her feet, a wave of vibration rising from the soles of her feet, and moving through her body like warm water, a recognition she received with her whole being, and not merely through one sense. It was the moment when her entire life gathered into a single point, the woman the world had once pushed aside as defective now standing here, being heard and honored, not because people pitied her, because they truly saw her. At the back of the hall, Delaney caught Warwick's eyes. He stood quietly apart from the crowd, not stepping onto the stage, not taking any attention for himself, only watching her with gray eyes that had grown less cold, and between them was an understanding that needed no words. The silent language only the two of them knew how to read in each other. They still came from different worlds, and Delaney knew the road ahead between her and him wouldn't be simple. There were still many things unresolved and many boundaries yet to be tested, but in that moment, none of that mattered, because what mattered was that they had truly seen each other, and that was already a beginning. And if there was one lesson to be drawn from everything that had happened, it was that courage had never meant the absence of fear, because Delaney had always been afraid of losing her brother, afraid of the debt, afraid of the fire, afraid even of the dangerous world she had accidentally stepped into, but she had still moved forward in the middle of that fear, and it was that choice to step forward instead of turning back that made her who she was. This story also teaches us something deeper about the way we see the people society is often too quick to judge as weak or lacking, because what the world called Delaney's defect was in fact the singular strength that saved a man's life twice. And that reminds each of us that a person's dignity doesn't lie in how much they resemble us, but in whether we're willing to truly see them, whether we're willing to step into their world instead of forever forcing them to reach toward ours. Respect, not pity, is what every human being deserves. If Delaney Hale's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video to help spread meaningful stories, so that every day you can listen to more moving and captivating stories that stir the heart. We'd love to know how this story made you feel, and whether it reminded you of someone in your own life, someone who was once underestimated, but carried an extraordinary quiet strength within. Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep in your heart, because we always cherish every story and every thought you send us. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last moment. May you, the person watching this video, always have truly good health, a joyful life, peace and love filling each day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.